Welcome to the Garden Holistic Pest and Disease Control class. I'm Dean Gunderson, the Director of Education here at Seed St. Louis, and let's get going. So first, I always just like to define kind of what we're talking about here. So what is a pest or a disease? So a disease is actually just a kind of subset of a pest. So when I talk about pests, I'm kind of talking about diseases and pests, because usually people think of pests as like animal and disease as microorganisms. But technically, a pest is any organism that damages, stunts, or kills a desirable plant, a plant that you don't want that to happen to. So that organism can be a bird, it can be a mammal, it can be an insect, it can be a microorganism like a fungus, a bacteria, or a virus. It could also be people. People are animals, or more commonly, the tools that they wield. I'll say in the fruit tree world, at least, weed eaters are by far the #1 killer of fruit trees that I see in the urban environment. And it can also be weeds. Weeds are organisms that are competing with your plants, and that competition can stunt or damage your plant in some way. And sometimes what we consider a pest, or what people will say is a pest, or what we assume is a pest, doesn't actually hurt the plant. So it's not actually a pest. It's just something along the lines of that it makes the fruit or the leaf or something look less desirable. And so we consider that bad, even though it isn't actually going to kill or damage your plant. So the term is a little convoluted, depending on who you ask. But first, how does a plant get pests? And again, this would include a disease or a pathogen or a pest insect. And there are 3 factors, all of which must be present. You need to have a susceptible plant. You need to have a plant that disease or that insect wants to infect or eat. You need to have that pest around, and you need to have an environment that is conducive to that happening. So just as an example, and this is in the fruit tree world, but as an example, there's a lot of fruit trees this year, particularly pears, that I've seen getting a disease called Pseudomonas, which we haven't seen a whole lot of around here, but because it pretty much only happens if you have a really cool, wet, early time of the spring, and then a frost that happens. And we had all of those things that just happened to happen all at the right time, which then allowed that disease to infect those susceptible plants. But if you don't have those right environmental conditions, it doesn't happen. So you need to have all 3 of those things happening at the same time. And so then how do you manage them? So you manage them by usually breaking one of those 3 things. You are either, not having a susceptible plant, or not allowing that disease or that pest to be around, or by altering the environment so it's not conducive to an infection. So this little pyramid here is called the Integrated Pest Management Pyramid, and it kind of shows you what you should be focusing on. So, prevention should be your foundation here, and then cultural or sanitation, and then physical or mechanical, and then biological, and then chemical, and then the sprays. So generally, this is what most people come to this class thinking they're going to learn is, what do I spray, or what do I squish, or what do I put out there to get rid of X pest or disease? But the better way to start is, well, how do you make sure you don't have that disease in the first place? So doing these things first, and then knowing what to do if all those things don't work, is important. But we're actually going to spend a fair amount of time talking about these lower tiers here, because they can be really, really helpful. And so just to give you an example, and I flipped the order here to show you the priority that it should be in. So just so you're not confused. But for prevention, this would be things like eliminating habitat. So eliminating, the things that a pest insect needs to thrive in your garden. Or eliminating the thing that a disease overwinters on. So that would be like eliminating habitat. Proper watering, making sure your plants are not getting too wet or are not water stressed, which any stress on your plant makes them more susceptible to especially disease infection, but also insect predation. And then just picking immune crops. So planting things that don't get disease can be a big thing. Cultural and sanitation would be things like cleaning up dropped fruit, prunings, diseased leaves and plants, intercropping, trellising, and we're gonna talk about all of these. Physical or mechanical, so that would be situations where like you know that an insect pest is gonna be a problem, like you're not growing an immune crop, you know, it's gonna be a problem, and so you're using some sort of physical barrier like a row cover or insect netting, or you're using a mechanical means of removing that problem, like picking off the insects, putting a fence up to keep rabbits out, using humming line to keep birds away, you know, things like that. Biological then would be things like encouraging predation of your insect pests through habitat creation and or introducing beneficial insects. And then chemical would be sprays. They would be, you know, what do you do to get rid of this insect once it's already here that is not, you know, physically removing it. So first starting with prevention. So in the garden here, one of the best ways, one of the, you know, the easiest ways to deal with a problem is to just sidestep it. Just plant something that doesn't have problems or doesn't have that problem that you're having. So this can look like planting things that are more heat or drought tolerant. Especially as we move into the summer, the significance there is that, again, the more stressed a plant is, you know, if it's like really doesn't like how hot it is outside, if it's really not adapted to that, if it's really stressed by the drier conditions we have in the summer, that stress weakens its immune response, just like it does to people. And so they are going to be more susceptible to disease infections, but again, also insects. Insects go after stressed plants. It's part of, evolutionary selection. You know, the pests wipe out the weak ones so that the strong ones are the ones that are multiplying and that plant population gets stronger. So planting things that are less stressed in our heat and humidity, but also dry conditions can be a way to reduce those things, or those that are less susceptible to pests. And also planting crops that aren't related to other things. So a lot of the plants that we grow in our vegetable garden are from just a few families. So, you know, things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, tomatillos, ground cherries, and potatoes are actually all very closely related and all have a lot of the same diseases on them. Pretty much all of our vining things in the summer. So your zucchini, your cucumbers, your winter squash, your pumpkins, your gourds, your loofahs, those are all pretty closely related. And so they can get a lot of the same insect issues and disease problems. So planting things that are not closely related to other things is another good way, because they tend to not have as many pest and disease issues. So that would be, so some of the best things for, you know, resilient plants for the summer would be things like sweet potatoes. Really well adapted to our summer, very pest and disease resistant. Okra, another great one. Cowpeas or black-eyed peas are great. Long beans are also a type of cowpea. Malabar spinach, which is a summer green. Celosia, which is another summer green, and that's this over here that also the butterflies love, but you eat the leafy greens of this. Celosia, when you're looking for it for its leafy greens, is also sometimes called Lagos spinach. Lagos is an Lagos, like the capital of Nigeria. Amaranth is another great one. So this is a picture of amaranth over here. And then Armenian cucumber. So Armenian cucumbers would be, they're actually a type of cantaloupe, but they taste exactly like cucumbers. But because they are not a cucumber, as long as you have free draining soil, like you're in a raised bed, or just a lighter soil, like not a heavy clay, they tend to do much better, as in they're much more resistant to especially disease pressure. Another two that I didn't put on here for some reason would be Tromboncino squash and then Seminole pumpkins, both of which are really well adapted to our heat and drought. They have huge root systems, but are also more resistant to disease and pests than most other squash. So those would be, specific varieties that do well. So planting those things that just have fewer pest problems is a big part of dealing with pests and disease. Weed avoidance. So weeds, also a type of pests. So growing plants that are more vigorous are going to have fewer issues with weeds because they can more quickly kind of cover the soil surface to have fewer weeds that are growing. And then also selecting taller varieties as opposed to little mini varieties can also help with weed pressure, especially in the summer, because those taller things are going to have less competition from weeds because they're going to be, again, shading the soil surface. Oh yeah, and I put them on this slide. So, things like butternut, Seminole pumpkins, and Tromboncino are good for disease and pest resistance in the squash family. And then for brassicas, red brassicas aren't any more resistant, but it's really easy to see those green cabbage worms on red brassicas. Not so easy to see them on the green ones. Also, eggshells are another one that is a type of prevention that you can use. So your tomatoes, but also your peppers might get a thing that's called blossom end rot that you might have seen, which is where the bottom of the fruit will turn black and kind of look like it's rotting. That is not a disease. That is a nutrient deficiency. So it's a calcium deficiency. So actually, if you've had that issue or you're worried about that issue, just throw some eggshells in the hole and then stick the tomato and the pepper plant on top, and you won't get blossom end rot. So again, just another type of prevention. Also watering. So again, water frequently if there's not rain. So crops should be watered as often as needed, which I know is not a real helpful, thing. I'm not going to say every day or every other day or anytime like that, because that's kind of not helpful information, because it depends on how hot it is and, how sunny it is and how big your plants are. There's lots of different factors. But anytime that the soil is dry, an inch below the surface, you should water. This could be anywhere from twice a year. That was a couple years ago. I literally watered my garden twice all year because it just was raining regularly and it was beautiful. And that can vary from that all the way to several times a week. It really just depends on the weather. But you can just stick your finger in the soil. Usually if you do up to about the second knuckle, if it's dry, like if you stick that in, you pull your finger out and it's dry, there's no moisture in there, you need to water. If you stick it down there and it's moist, even if it's not wet on the very surface, you don't need to water. In terms of technique of watering, it's best to avoid watering the leaves. Wet leaves encourage foliar diseases, especially in tomatoes. And then timing. Evening is a great time to water if you're using things like soaker hoses or drip irrigation, because the soil will stay wet longer, because it'll stay wet kind of all night long and into the morning. If you are watering overhead, like with a hose or a sprinkler, it's best to do that in the morning so that the leaves will dry off quickly as the sun comes up. Midday is not ideal because the water on the leaves can actually cause some burning on the leaves. But all of that being said, the best time to do it is just whenever you can as well. If you're like, oh, I missed it this morning, I'll wait till tomorrow morning, but your plants need water, don't wait till tomorrow morning. Water now. If they need water, water it, even if it's not an ideal time. But if you're picking, those are kind of the rankings there. Mulch is also can be really valuable. There's some people who debate about it because there are some pests that like mulch, but also mulch can reduce weed pressure. It helps keep the soil moist longer, which reduces stress on your plants. And it also provides habitat for beneficial insects like beetles who eat weed seeds primarily, and spiders who eat your pests. And so, it provides habitat for pests, but it also provides habitat for beneficials. So I generally like mulch, but some people disagree with me on that. Then we get to cultural controls. So, one up from prevention is cultural control. So in the garden, this looks like cleaning up dropped fruit. So, if you have a tomato that is dropping, fruit, or, you like pick a tomato and you're like, oh, gross, and you just throw it on the ground, don't do that. Because if it's gross, if it had, a split in it or there's a disease on it or something, and you just drop it on the ground, then that disease can just spread right back up and infect more tomatoes. So, clean up any fruit that is dropping off of your plants. So your tomatoes, your cucumbers, your peppers, your, whatever, clean that stuff up. Also dropped leaves. If you've got kind of dead, nasty looking leaves that could be diseased laying in your garden, clean those up, put them in your compost bin, get rid of them, or bury them under some mulch so that they're not going to easily reinfect the leaves of your plant. Remove any dead or diseased plants, especially diseased plants, and then remove diseased leaves. If you're seeing that, if you're seeing leaves that are, got disease, not good, remove them and get them out of the garden. Another cultural control is trellising. So keeping your plants up, having them grow up a trellis of some kind increases airflow. So it kind of, speeds the drying of leaves in the morning from dew or after rain. And that is going to reduce disease because a lot of the diseases in the summer are fungal in nature. And so they like that higher humidity. And so keeping your plants up where they're going to have drier conditions, thus lower humidity, you're going to have fewer fungal infections. It also makes the lives of pests less protected. When the plants are up, they can't hide as much from, birds or other things. And it's more windy, it's hotter, it's less, it's not as comfortable as if the plant is just sprawling on the ground for those insect pests. So in terms of trellises, you're wanting, the things I would recommend would be things like the things to trellis would be things like pole beans, tomatoes, peas, cucumbers, squash, and melons can also trellis well, as long as you have a heavy duty enough trellis. If you have cattle panel, which we really like, it's heavy duty enough that you can trellis any of these things on it. You can do like an arch trellis, like in this picture here. You could do a ramp trellis, which is what this picture is, although it's a little hard to tell. But this is where it's just laying kind of horizontally at an angle up above the bed. You can also just use poles, like bamboo poles or sticks, branches, or teepees, where you tie those together in kind of a cone shape. You can also just use a fence. All those things work great for trellising. And then another cultural control is intercropping. So intercropping is just the idea of mixing plants together, so not just having big blocks of all the same thing. And the reason that this can be helpful is that if you have a pest or disease and it infects one plant and then everything around it is that same plant, it's going to be really easy for that pest or disease to spread to those other things, versus if you have lots of different things kind of mixed together or planted in small groups, it's going to be harder for it to infect kind of the whole patch of that crop. So some easy things to intercrop to kind of grow together would be the onion family. So, onions, leeks, chives, garlic, shallots, all those things do well planted around pretty much anything, but especially brassicas can do really well. So, if you have some cabbage like these here, you could just stick, a big onion here and have it grow up. And then also crops, just kind of as a general way to think about intercropping, you want to plant things together with different geographical needs, so different spatial needs. So planting things like a root crop and then another row of like a leafy crop, followed by another row of root crop. So that, the leafy crop is using a lot of the above ground space, the root crop can use the below ground space a little more, and you can kind of stick them together versus trying to plant, a bunch of root crops all next to each other where they're all going to be pushing each other below the soil surface. Also thinking about like a tall skinny crop like an onion planted in between big spreading crops like most brassicas, like broccoli or cabbage or kale or collards. And then the Three Sisters is a great example of kind of the mindset of coming up with intercropping. So the Three Sisters is one name for a common practice in North America where the indigenous people would grow corn, beans, and squash all together in the same field. So they would plant clumps of corn kind of widely spaced. The corn would grow, upright, and then they would plant pole beans, so the long vining beans, at the base of the corn. So they would grow up the corn using the corn as a trellis, and then they would plant squash around the corn, and it would grow and fill in the space between the corn, shading, reducing water loss, reducing weed pressure on the corn. And then the beans would provide nitrogen to both of the crops. And so they all would kind of kind of benefit each other. And then the corn and the beans would also provide a light shade to the squash, which can help when we get really hot to prevent them from wilting. So that's just like, kind of an example of how you can kind of mix these things together. If you're just thinking about kind of what do they need, what is their shape, all those different things. Some other cultural controls would be things like dense planting. So, don't plant things really, really far apart. Plant them kind of the spacing that it tells you to do, because it will shorten the amount of time that the soil isn't covered. So it's not shaded. Shaded soil is not going to grow as many weeds. And so you don't have as many weeds that you have to deal with. Another thing is what I call season shifting. So this is the idea of finding varieties or just totally different crops that will grow at a time that a pest or disease that you have a problem with is less active or less damaging. So a common example of this is some people will wait until kind of mid-June to plant their squash because they think it helps reduce vine borer pressure, and that works for some people. Or, cabbage worms are a big problem on brassicas, but there are varieties that will survive our winter. And so planting an overwintering brassica so that they're growing at a time when there are not as many cabbage worms and cabbage moths around can really reduce that pest problem. Overwintering crops also have just fewer weeds. There's not as much growing. And the weeds that do grow in the winter are much easier to handle than the really aggressive grasses that grow in summer. And then, another kind of flavor of this is just season extension, starting stuff earlier so that it will avoid some of those, later spring, early summer pests, or getting things to grow later into the fall so you can plant them a little later after the temperatures have cooled down. Those are all things that can help you out. And then we get into physical or mechanical. So the most basic one of these is hand picking. So you see an insect, pick it off. So especially in an early pest situation, where you're just starting to see pests, sometimes just picking off the ones you see can prevent that pest population from really exploding and getting out of hand, where then you are needing to use chemical sprays to control them. Bursts of water can also be helpful, especially for really small insects like aphids or even flea beetles to some extent, where just like forcefully hosing off the plants would then, knocking those insects off. And because they're so tiny, if you knock them 10 feet over that way, that's a really long distance for them to crawl back and find that plant again. Scaring also fits into this. So humming line, which is what this material is over here, is a really effective thing for keeping birds away. If you have issues with birds eating your plants, you can string up some humming line around your garden and they will pretty much stay away. There are some other options like CDs or bird eye balloons that work, but the humming line we have found to be pretty consistent and is a little more visually appealing. And then repellents. There are repellents that you can buy that do work to some degree. They tend to only work if there's some food somewhere else for that animal to come and eat, or to go and eat. If there's too many animals in your area, if there's too many deer, if there's too many rabbits, they're going to eat something that smells bad over starving to death. So repellents work in some situations, and in some situations they do not. Barriers are also probably kind of the most consistently effective, the thing that is like kind of the most foolproof, it's going to work. So this would be fencing, basically putting up a physical structure of some kind to prevent things from getting in. So this would be more for animals. So things like deer, rabbits, and raccoons. Fencing will keep out. Aluminum foil wrapped around the trunk, or not the trunk, but like the base of your squash stem can help deter vine borers. It's not 100% effective, but it does reduce the infestation rate. Bird netting is something that you can put over plants that are having birds eat them, although again, the humming line works really well. And then fabrics. So this would be stuff like row cover, which is this over here, which is good to use in the cooler seasons, or insect netting, which is really the best for kind of all year, but especially in the summer, this is what you want to use. And it's just a really fine mesh material that has small enough holes that if you put it over your plants when you plant them, and this is critical, don't plant your, your cabbage out there and then a month later be like, oh, maybe I'll put some insect netting on it. Because a lot of times in that instance, the eggs have already been laid of the pests. And then when you put the insect netting over it, all you're doing is preventing predators from getting in and eating your pests. So like literally, like if you're going to do this, like the exact same day that you are putting your seedlings in the ground, put the netting over it is really the best way to use that material. And it's very effective for insect pests, but also for animal pests. A rabbit is not really going to get in there. A deer is probably not going to get in there. If they really wanted to, I'm sure they could find a way to open it. But generally they're not going to do that. And then for small insects, eggshells and diatomaceous earth can also act as a physical barrier. So if you put kind of a ring of crushed eggshells or diatomaceous earth around the base of a plant, it can deter pests that crawl up from the ground. So things like slugs, snails, or even rodents from kind of crawling and bothering your plants. And then there are physical barrier sprays. So this would be a kaolin clay. It's also called surround. So this is a material, this is what it looks like here. It's literally a really fine white clay that you mix up in like a water slurry and spray it onto your plants. And it creates this white barrier that to small, insects trying to eat that plant, it's like they're eating a big, mouthful of dirt and they're having to crawl over this really aggravating clay material to get to the plant. And so they're generally just not going to bother. They're going to go eat something else. Kind of the downsides to this are, one, it's annoying to apply. You need to apply it after rain events, not usually every single time it rains, but if we get, a good day or two of rain, you're going to need to go and reapply it. And also you need to, apply it as you get new leaves. So as you can see from this squash plant, we applied it and then you had all this new growth come out the top and the clay's not on the new growth. So you need to keep applying as you get new leaves, or, they're going to leave these leaves alone, but they're going to come and attack these. And that's, not all that helpful. And then lastly, I will say traps. So these are very low impact ways to kill select pests. If there is a pest insect that has a trap, this is a great way to handle that pest without impacting beneficial insects at all, really. Most traps, though, are only effective for monitoring, not control. So a lot of pest traps that are out there are designed so that you put them up, and then, you check the trap, and then, one day you go out, you're like, oh, that insect is in there. That means I need to start spraying, or I need to start, checking for this attacking my crop. So it's more of a way to know when to start acting about a pest, as opposed to a way to catch enough to kill them. I'll say one of the only exceptions to that is that Japanese beetle traps do work. And I know that has become a very controversial opinion, but I have used them for many years and they're incredibly effective if you do it appropriately. And there are specific ways that you need to do it. Lincoln University and University of Missouri did trials on this, and they came up with a protocol that worked really well. That, again, I have tried. Some partners that we work with in Kansas City have done for many years now. And as long as you follow those instructions, it works really, really well. And we have those instructions up on our website, but you can also look up Japanese beetle mass trapping, and you'll find resources from University of Missouri and Lincoln University on how to do that. But when I'm saying mass trapping, like, this is what we're talking about. It's not those little dinky bags they sell at Lowe's and Home Depot. It's like big old containers that you are catching literally thousands. Like the first year I put these out, the population has kind of tapered off the last couple of years where I'm at. But the first year I did it, like, we were literally getting trash cans full of Japanese beetles for the first year. So you need a large container to catch them. Cucumber beetles, some people have found success with just putting out like yellow plastic plates with water in them that the beetles would be attracted to, and then they drowned. And then beer can be an effective trap for slugs and snails. They get attracted to it because it has that rotting smell. And then they get in it and they die because alcohol is toxic. It like eats away at their body and they die. So then there's also biological controls. So biological control to get this to work. So this is, having insects or animals eat the pests for you to really have this, or diseases. You can have, beneficial microorganisms that can attack and destroy disease-causing fungus. So to really have these biological controls, generally what that means is you are doing things to build a robust ecosystem in your garden that will create habitat for beneficial organisms. And those beneficial organisms can be everything from birds of prey, like hawks, eagles, falcons, owls. Songbirds are voracious consumers of moth caterpillars, which are like some of the primary insect pests in the garden. Bats are huge consumers of night-flying moths, which is where those caterpillars come from. Predatory and parasitic insects. So ladybugs get a lot of attention for eating aphids, and they do that. But something that should get a lot more attention is parasitic wasps, which are like nightmare fuel. So there's various ways that parasitic wasps work, but one of the ways is what you're seeing here. So this is a female that has found a caterpillar that fits its biological needs, and it will literally come up and it will sting it, and it will inject it with a paralyzing agent so it cannot move, and then it will lay eggs inside this living caterpillar. The female will then fly away. The caterpillar will eventually, the paralyzing agent will wear off, assuming that it doesn't get eaten by a bird or something while it's sitting there paralyzed, and then it will go about its life. And at some point in the future, those eggs will hatch inside it, like alien style, and eat it from the inside out. And then they will become new parasitic wasps, and they will repeat that process and kill lots of those caterpillars for you. There's also beneficial fungus, there's beneficial bacteria, there are beneficial nematodes, there are beneficial microarthropods, and then worms. Everyone usually considers worms as good, but they are also good. These organisms can outcompete, they can eat, they can parasitize, they can suppress, or they can create inhospitable habitats for pest organisms. So some of the ways that you can support these biological controls for kind of your large allies, so things like birds or bats. Owls and other birds of prey eat lots of rodents. Barn owl, you can put up barn owl boxes just like you would put up like a birdhouse. There are plans online that you can make a box to attract barn owls to your area. And each barn owl, like an adult barn owl, eats 155 rodents a year. If that barn owl, finds a mate and lays some eggs, they found that like one barn owl family generally eats about 1,000 rodents a year. So if you've got a lot of problem with voles, get some barn owls and you won't have very many voles anymore. But also putting up perches, putting up places where those birds of prey can sit high and look is also going to attract them to your area. Songbirds, like I mentioned, eat lots of caterpillars. There was a study in a vineyard where they just put bluebird boxes up, and they found a 10-fold increase in the number of bluebirds in that vineyard. So, you might not see that exact thing, but just doing things as simple as putting up, specific bird houses for specific birds that can be eating predator pest insects for you can cause population increases. And then a huge thing for benefiting your songbird population especially is keep your cats inside. The only organism on the planet that has caused more species extinctions than cats are human beings. Cats have caused hundreds and hundreds of species to go extinct because they're also kind of the only other species on the planet that kills for fun. They kill lots of birds. I think I'm trying to remember. I saw a study one time, and I think cats are the #1 killer of birds. It's something like 5 billion birds a year or something crazy are killed by cats. So, people are worried about windmills killing birds, and that's a problem. But windmills kill 1% of the birds that die every year, and cats, it's 30% or something crazy. So keeping cats inside. Bats can also be really beneficial because, like I said, they eat night-flying moths. So putting up bat boxes. And then also it may seem a little counterintuitive, but planting or having native trees like oaks, willows, poplars, and native prunuses. So things like, you know, the native black cherry or the wild plum around. Those genuses, those family of trees, support the most caterpillar species of any plant species. Trees, shrubs, grasses, like of all the plants, those four support the most. And so having those around means that there will be more caterpillars around, which means that those songbirds will have food year round, so that when there are pests in your garden, they are right there waiting to eat them. And also having a water source. You know, in our urban environments, we tend to not want to have lots of stagnant water around because we don't want mosquitoes, which makes sense. But if we have a really long dry period and we don't have any standing water around anywhere, where are these birds supposed to be getting water? Where are these owls and bats? Where are they supposed to be getting water to drink? If there's not water around and it's really dry, they're going to leave. They're going to go somewhere where they have water so they don't, you know, die. And so having something around, and something that, you know, has, you know, BT in it or something, so that you're not going to get mosquitoes, or that has, you know, a fountain going so that you're not going to get mosquitoes growing in it, is a good idea, because we don't want lots of mosquitoes around. But having a water source can be helpful for those, and also helpful for our beneficial insects as well. They also need moisture. So supporting our small allies, so these are our pollinators, but also our predatory insects and our parasitic insects, like the parasitic wasps we talk about. To create habitat for them, we really want to be having plants and having things around that are going to provide food for them, shelter for them, and provide overwintering and egg-laying sites for them. So we have like a whole class that we did, I think it was a month or two ago, that's up on our YouTube, where we talk about some of the like, go into more of the specifics of how to create habitat just for these beneficial insects that you can check out. But one of the big ways to do that is to aim for a continuous bloom. So having things blooming in your space as many weeks out of the year as possible, ideally of native plants. And also, the smaller the flower, the better, especially for those predatory and parasitic insects. They can get into small flowers a lot easier, and pollinating insects can also get into those small flowers. So you get kind of the broadest appeal from small flowered things. And this is just a list of some of our favorite natives. Well, mostly native. Comfrey is not native, but all the other ones, let me check here before I say that. Yeah, all the other ones are native and are really good for creating these habitats, as well as, again, just having lots of stuff. Just have lots of flowering stuff. And then supporting your microallies. So these would be beneficial microorganisms. So we generally think of microorganisms as, you know, pests. They're disease. Like, that's what we think of. But most microorganisms that are around in your garden are either neutral, as in they're not doing anything bad or good for you, and some of them are actually beneficial. Microorganisms in the soil and on the leaf and stem tissue of your plants can actually make your plants more healthy, more resilient, and resistant to pest and disease infection, and just healthier, happier plants. So some of the ways to support them would be to avoid tillage. So tilling your soil, like with a tiller, obliterates all life in the soil except bacteria. So all of the beneficial fungus, all of the worms. You know, if you have a worm and you run a tiller, how do you think that worm is surviving? It's not. So unless it's, you know, down below where you're tilling and then comes back up, anything that is in that range where the tiller is moving is getting sliced and diced into a bunch of different pieces. An alternative to this, if you still do need to break up your soil, aerate your soil, is a digging fork or a shovel or a broad fork. And this is a picture of one design of broad fork. And those are just ways that you kind of push them into the soil and kind of lean back, and it kind of lifts and cracks the soil, as opposed to pulverizing and mixing, which is what tillers do. And then it's good to add compost to your soil, because that organic matter in your soil is what those beneficial microorganisms are going to live on when there are not plants growing in your soil, like in the winter or after you harvest your spring crops, but before you plant your summer or something like that. So in that same vein, it's beneficial to aim for the soil to be covered and or for something to always be growing. So in the winter, grow a cover crop if you can. Or if a cover crop doesn't make sense, or you just don't want to do a cover crop, cover the soil with a mulch, because that mulch will also break down and provide food to those microorganisms. If your soil is just bare for 6 months out of the year, and then you till it, there's really not that much life in the soil. And generally, when things are relatively sterile, the first things to get established and grow are diseases. And so having a nice, healthy, robust population of microorganisms in your soil is actually one of the best ways to avoid diseases getting a foothold. And then compost teas can also be helpful. So, adding some compost to, a bucket of water and then stirring it vigorously for a minute or two, and then, getting the compost out, filtering it out, and then using a watering can to sprinkle that water on the soil is actually going to inoculate all the good microorganisms that were in that compost into your soil and have it soak down into the soil profile for you. But you do all those things and sometimes the pests still come. So if you are having, a problematic pest infection, not just like, oh, there's one bug here, what should I spray to kill it? But like, oh my gosh, I picked them off, they just keep coming, they're causing a lot of damage, or whatever. If you are wanting to grow your plants, generally speaking, organically, it's really important to know what you are dealing with. If you're not interested in organic and you're like, there's a bug, let's throw 7 dust everywhere, you don't need to know what bug that is, because 7's going to kill it no matter what it is. But if you're not wanting to do that, if you're wanting to do more organic controls, then it's really, really vital to know what it is that you're dealing with. And even if you are going to use 7, it's important to have a general idea of what the problem is, because just using those general sprays that are just like, oh, this is what you do and it just kills everything, can sometimes be unnecessary. I mean, it might not even work. If you're like, oh my gosh, there's this problem, all my fruit are rotting on the bottom, it must be a disease, I'm gonna, spray neem everywhere. Well, if it's blossom end rot, that's not going to do anything, because blossom end rot is a calcium deficiency. So spraying neem is not going to fix any disease problems. And so it's important to know that not all damage is a pest or a disease. Sometimes what might look like a pest or a disease could be from improper pollination. If you're getting squash that starts growing, little tiny, starts growing, and then pretty immediately kind of shrivels up and turns black, that's not a disease, that's improper pollination. You didn't have enough pollinators around pollinating your squash completely enough for it to form fully. So, fertilizer is not going to fix that. A spray is not going to fix that. Bees are what's going to fix that. Or you hand pollinating it is what's going to fix that. Or like I talked about with the blossom end rot, that that's a nutrient deficiency, but it does look like a disease, like my fruit is rotting, like there must be a rot or something. Or I always like this example too. You could say, oh my gosh, something's eating my leaves, what do I need to spray? Well, something is eating your leaves, but what's eating your leaves is a leafcutter bee, which is a native bee, not going to kill your plants. It's just going to cause these little cuts, and then it's going to go on and live its life. So you could spray to kill those bees, but I don't recommend that, and I recommend against it. But it's just important to kind of figure out what it is you're dealing with. So there's lots of different ways to do that. You can, but the biggest way is just to look online. Take a picture of what your problem is. You can post it in any of the millions of online groups about gardening. Have somebody tell you, or you can just start Googling like bottom of tomato rotting and see kind of what it could be, and you'll oftentimes find pictures. You're like, oh yeah, that's what it is, and then you can figure out what to do from there. Another one that is kind of straddles the line here between biological and kind of sprays would be introducing a biological control. So this is where you can artificially introduce predatory or parasitic insects or nematodes. So introducing a beneficial nematode or a beneficial parasitic wasp is generally much more effective than introducing a predatory insect. So, releasing a bunch of ladybugs out in your garden is probably not going to do a whole lot because they can fly. They're just going to probably fly away, and they're pretty big. And so like a few of them might stick around, but a lot of them are just going to kind of fly away. But this can be a helpful way to address an acute infestation, but those predatory insects are generally going to disperse and leave pretty quickly if you don't already have habitat established for them. And generally, if you have habitat established, there's probably already ones there that are going to be doing a lot of that work for you. But like I said, beneficial nematodes and parasitic wasps are good ways to do this cheaply because they're much smaller. They don't move as fast. They don't move as far. So they're more likely to be beneficial in that direct area. Another kind of introduced biological thing that is actually like a thing that you are applying, like kind of a spray that you're doing, would be something called, they're called like kind of biofungicides, they're called sometimes. So these are sprays that artificially boost the microbiome with select sprays. So this is a spray that is not going to directly kill anything, but it just has bacteria in it that are very, very fast growing. So the idea being you spray this on a plant before a disease shows up, and this bacteria is then going to like take over the surface of the plant so that if a disease comes along, it's much harder for it to get established because the surface is already covered in this thing. So you can get things like Monterey Complete Disease Control, which is again a spray to boost the microbiome and acts as a preventative. It is not going to treat an active infection, but it can be a thing that if you're like, every year I get X, whatever disease problem you have. So this is not going to work for insect pests, but whatever disease problem you have, you're like, every year I get this, like a foliar disease, mildew or something like that. Then before you get that, you can start spraying this and it will prevent infection. Not every time, it's not 100% effective, but it's gonna greatly reduce the rate of infection. And there are also some other kind of organic sprays that you can use that again are not killing anything, but they're kind of building up the immune response of your plants. Regalia is one that is relatively new. That's actually just an extract of giant knotweed, which is an awful invasive. They just like made an alcohol extract of it, just like you would make like almond extract. And they found that when you spray it on plants, they suddenly become more immune to things. So that is available. It's relatively expensive and you need to buy it online, but that is another option that you can look into. And then the true chemical controls. So there are just a note on them. There are plenty of synthetic sides. So, fungicides, insecticides, pesticides, herbicides. There's lots of synthetic sides out there that can knock back pests, weeds, diseases very fast. Unfortunately, they also tend to wipe out beneficial things, beneficial microorganisms, beneficial insects. And that includes all of them, like herbicides, things that kill weeds also kill beneficial fungus, they've found. So like these things knock back also these beneficial things. And the really nasty ones can also, also used to wipe out like birds and stuff. So these are not generally specific. They can have broader impacts than we can often see. And there is even some evidence that they disrupt protein synthesis in the plants. And this can make plants more susceptible to pests and disease, thus requiring more sides. It's a great business model. Therefore, we will be talking about lower impact organic options, some of which will still have these problems. They're not magic, but they tend to have fewer of these problems, but they're more important to know exactly what it is that you're dealing with. However, synthetics can still be a potent tool that you might need sometime. I'm not here to tell you not to ever use them and that they're always evil and a terrible, terrible idea. Like anything else with side effects, it's a cost-benefit analysis. If you're looking at a situation where, you've tried all your other options and you can either lose your entire crop and, lose all of your work, not get any food, or maybe use one of these chemicals once or twice, it's up to you of which is a better option, and I can't make that decision for you. And I also like to point out too that just because something is organic doesn't mean that it is inherently safe or non-toxic. Organic legally just means that it is not derived from a synthetic source. So pyrethrins are an organic pesticide, very effective. They're very effective because they're a neurotoxin to all organisms, including humans. And so although it is organic and you can buy it at the store and it says you can spray it on your vegetables, and you can, and there are ways to use it safely, but that doesn't mean it's safe. You still need to be very careful with pyrethrins. You know, if a kid gets a hold of it and drinks it, it is a very bad day. Sulfur is an organic compound that is highly acidic. You need to be really careful that you don't get sulfur dust in your eyes or breathing it in. It's very highly acidic. Streptomycin, which is, an antibiotic that you need a prescription to go get, was also registered as organic for a long time and was just relatively recently removed from the organic list because it's from a naturally occurring bacteria. Spinosad is a bacteria. It's organic. It's actually a really nice or a really effective organic control for a lot of things, but it is a broad spectrum insecticide and it will kill bees. It will kill beneficial insects just as much as a synthetic pesticide. So I just want to be clear here that, sides are a thing, those synthetic things, and just because something is organic doesn't mean it's safe, doesn't mean you don't need to be careful with them, because you do. So now we're going to talk about some of those that we do use sometimes. So horticultural oil is one. So this is a light oil that coats and suffocates eggs and small insects. So this is most commonly used in fruit trees before they leaf out to kill overwintering pests. It used to be called dormant oil, and there are still dormant oils, but they've now been able to create horticultural oils that are light enough that they now just call horticultural oil that you can spray even when the leaves are on the plant. And so it can also be useful in the vegetable garden to kill things like soft-bodied insects, including larvae of hard-bodied insects, or aphids or whiteflies, or a lot of these smaller insects. It can be really effective against, and just follow the instructions on the label. Make sure that you're getting a light horticultural oil, not a dormant oil. If you spray a dormant oil on your vegetables, it will kill them because it's too heavy. It suffocates the plant as well. Insecticidal soap is something that gets talked about a lot. It's generally not super effective for big problematic pests. It's effective for small things. It's effective for things like aphids, young scale insects, whiteflies, psyllids, mealybugs, spider mites. It does not work on caterpillars or beetles, and it must be sprayed on the pest to be effective. And this is not like dish soap. This is a specific insect killing soap. It's a potassium based one. So that's what we're talking about here. Neem is another one that gets a lot of press, I would say. And in my experience, it is the jack of all trades, master of none. It's mostly just a deterrent. It's not really great at dealing with any insect if there's a major infestation. Because it is an oil, you do need to be careful with it, especially when the temperatures get into the 90s, as it can burn your leaves. But its oil kind of background does make it helpful for, again, a lot of those smaller insects. It can be really helpful for basically a lot of the stuff that insecticidal soap will do. Neem also does things like aphids, leaf miners, thrips, mealybugs, whiteflies. But it can also be useful, again, particularly as a repellent or a deterrent for larger things like potato beetles, cucumber beetles, bean beetles, Japanese beetles. But if you've got, Japanese beetles swarming your plant and you spray some neem on it, they're not going to go anywhere. It's more like, I get Japanese beetle problems. I saw one, over there the other day. I'm going to spray my plant with neem so that they don't settle in and start eating on my plant. BT is an absolutely great one for the vegetable garden. So this is another bacterial-based spray, like the Monterey Complete Disease Control that we talked about, except this is one that does act as a pesticide. It does kill insects. The insect must ingest the material that is sprayed with BT to be affected. So it's not going to impact any beneficial insects. It's only going to be impacting things that are eating the leaf that you sprayed on it. And also the bacteria is only toxic to caterpillars that are in the Lepidopteran family. So again, even if a bee came along and did eat, pollen that was sprayed with BT, it's not going to impact the bee because the bee is not a Lepidopteran caterpillar. So Lepidopteran caterpillars include things like cabbage worms, cabbage loopers, cutworms, and actually squash vine borers, kind of. So it can help with squash vine borers, but you need to spray it on before they get into the stem so that they're eating it as they're boring into the stem, and then it kills them. If they're already in the stem eating your plant, it's not going to do anything. But especially for your cabbages, which always have all those worms on them, BT is a really great material for that. Another chemical one, which is really kind of a physical control, would be diatomaceous earth. So diatomaceous earth is actually really tiny rocks. So you want to use eye protection and some type of face mask because you don't want to be breathing this in as you're spraying it around the garden, because the little pieces, if you look at them under a microscope, are actually really sharp. So if you breathe it in, you're then kind of like breathing in these really sharp little things that are going to get into your lungs, which is not great. And what it does is it cuts soft-bodied insects. So if you spray this all over your plant, you see this like white dust, and then you get this soft-bodied caterpillar or aphid that crawls over it, and it literally cuts them up, and they bleed out or dehydrate, die. It also sticks to the bodies of insects, which can restrict breathing and dehydrate them. You want to sprinkle it on dry. This is not a wet apply thing. So you're sprinkling it on, so you can use kind of a pump sprayer like this, or you can put it into like an old soda bottle and poke some holes in the lid and then kind of squeeze the soda bottle and it'll kind of puff out clouds. Works the same way. And it basically just makes life hard for any insect that crawls on the plant. So it is particularly helpful for caterpillars and other soft-bodied insects, as well as small, hard-bodied insects. So this is a great one for flea beetles on eggplants, which are a big problem so far this year because it's really dry. And then the broad spectrums. So broad spectrums will kill everything. These should be the spray of last resort. And only sprays, but these are the only sprays that will kill beetles. So if you have like a huge harlequin beetle infestation or Japanese beetle infestation and you don't know what to do, in the organic world, these are your only options, are these broad spectrum insecticides. Spinosad is my favorite. It's from a bacteria that was originally found in a rum barrel, fun fact. And then pyrethrins are also registered as organic as they come from the chrysanthemum flower. They affect the nervous systems of pests, so they're really effective. They can cause skin irritation. And again, they are also neurotoxic to people. So you do need to be really careful with how you handle pyrethrins. And lastly, fungicides. So if you're having fungal issues, copper, sulfur, whey, and neem are really your organic options. They are most effective as preventative, particularly whey and neem, not really effective at all when you have an active infection, in my experience, but they are helpful as a preventative. I also put this vinegar spray on here. This is something that is just like an anecdotal thing that we have this one orchard that has used this and it's worked really well for them. So I can't like promise that it'll work, but you can give it a shot. And it is important though that you don't have any more vinegar than 2 parts water to 1 part vinegar. If you do higher rates of vinegar, you can burn your leaves. And that is kind of a quick rundown of holistic pest and disease management in your vegetable garden. Thank you for coming.